Welcome, everyone. It is noon, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Hilda, did you want to announce the Spanish interpretation again?
Yes, thank you. Buenos días a todos, ya son las 12 del día. Vamos a empezar esta reunión para interpretación al español. Por favor, presione o teclee en la figura de globo terrestre que es en la parte inferior derecha de la pantalla. Haga un clic ahí y después elija español como idioma. Si usted estuviera en su teléfono, van a ver 3 puntitos en la parte superior derecha de su pantalla del teléfono. Hágale un clic ahí y después elija español como idioma. For those of you English speakers that do not speak Spanish, if you can please click on the little globe, there is going to be a globe icon that is on the lower right side of your computer. Click in there and just choose English as a language. And then if anybody asks a question in Spanish, you will hear it in English. And for those of you that have a phone, what you need to click is like the 3 dots that are in the upper part of the right side of your screen. Click in there and just choose interpretation services and choose English as a language. So right now I am going to be going to my interpretation room. Thank you so much and good luck.
Thank you, Hilda. Thank you all for joining us for the Prevention Services webinar. I'm Haley Figueroa with the DPS Substance Use Prevention Team. Each month, we focus on a different topic related to the health of our youth. This webinar series happens on the first Wednesday of every month. So a few housekeeping items first. We are going to have a Q&A. So as you see at the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A, so there'll be an opportunity at the end to ask questions to Dr. Glover. Spanish interpretation, as you heard, is available by clicking the interpretation button. We are going to be recording this session with captions that will be available on our website after the presentation. And it'll also be sent to you in an email as well. So we're really excited today to welcome Dr. Jenna Glover to join us to discuss how COVID has impacted kids' mental health. She will help us to explore ways to emotionally support kids as they transition back to the school year. We'll identify how to support children with anxiety and the many emotions they might be experiencing during this transition. So Dr. Jenna Glover is a licensed psychologist and associate professor in the departments of psychiatry at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. She serves as the director of psychology training at Children's Hospital Colorado, and she utilizes acceptance-based therapies with adolescents across a range of internalizing disorders. So Dr. Glover provides community outreach, giving talks and lectures on promoting mental wellness and self-care, and has also given TED Talks on this topic. So welcome, Dr. Glover.
Thanks so much, Haley. And I am grateful to be here today talking about something that I am passionate about, which is kids' mental health. And also I would say that I'm incredibly passionate and invested in understanding how the COVID pandemic has impacted our kids' mental health, and just sharing that information today and brainstorming together ways that we can help our kids. So I titled the presentation Transitioning Back to the Future, because it does seem like in some ways we're going back to something that was a little more familiar, but in many ways we are in a future where things will never be the same. And that offers us a lot of challenges in terms of how our kids are going to adjust to that and how we support them best in doing that. So today, my hope is to share several different ideas with you. But first of all, just to talk about how has COVID actually impacted our kids' mental health and how it's impacted us as parents. And then from there, maybe learn some ideas about how we can adapt and help your kids be more successful during transitions, how you can help support in terms of them building social connections. And then finally, what are a few strategies for coping with the stress and anxiety in kind of the ever-changing stressors that we are facing. And then whenever I present, my hope is that you have a little bit of fun and you actually enjoy the presentation. So fingers crossed, I'll try to throw in some humor where I can, even though this is a heavy topic. So here's my first attempt at humor. This was definitely last year. If COVID were a person, certainly the Harry Potter reference is a good one. All right, so jumping in, this is just anecdotal from me as a therapist. So I work with all kinds of kids. young kids, adolescents. I primarily work with tweens and teens who are experiencing anxiety, depression, and suicidal thinking. And I noticed, over the last year and a half, we've seen kind of some interesting transitions with kids and their mental health. And so I think in spring 2020, we actually saw something pretty interesting with mental health, which is the demand for mental health services and the number of kids coming to the emergency department actually went dramatically down when COVID started. And I think there was kind of two things about that, which first of all, we were kind of just all like, what the heck is happening and what does this even mean? And there was also a disruption in services. And so there were a lot of kids who were used to getting therapy, and all of a sudden we had to shut down and we couldn't offer outpatient therapy. And we weren't equipped to do that for the number of kids that we see. So it took us 2-3 weeks for these kids to get services. But it was really a time of of people wondering what's going to happen. And then pretty soon, kids and parents really last summer were in this kind of mix of, oh my gosh, this is going to be terrible. What's going to happen? And then on the other side of that, like, hopefully everything will be okay. Hopefully, like when school starts again, things will be back to normal. And so there was a lot of ambivalence. And then I would say during winter 2021, that's when we started to really see a mental health crisis. Now, I will say before the pandemic even started, we were in a crisis with our kids. So 1 in 5 kids, so 20% of kids have before the pandemic had a mental health disorder. And half of those kids were diagnosed before the age of 14. The other thing that was startling about that is only 20% of those 1 in 5 kids actually got therapy. We call that the 20-20 problem. 20% of kids have mental health problems, and only 20% of that 20% get help. So we were already in a problematic area, but in the winter it got so much worse. And there was this sense of hopelessness that a lot of kids started to have of, when is this ever going to change? And is anything going to get better? And I think there was a lot of hope when the vaccines came out and when kids started returning to school that this was going to be really helpful for kids. And so last spring, I think there was this this optimism of things are going to be better. But what in fact happened is we saw the mental health crisis hit kind of a fever point with our kids, and there was a huge amount of crisis. So in April of 2021 here at Children's Hospital, we saw a huge increase in visits to the emergency department for kids who are in mental health crisis or suicidal. And throughout April, about 50% of the kids who presented to the emergency department at Children's Hospital were there for a mental health crisis, and we'd never seen that before. So our kids have been through a lot. During the summer, we saw a little bit of a dip, which we almost always see with kids' mental health problems, with the stress of school being gone. But I would say that our services have held pretty steady, and we anticipate that this fall, we're going to see a similar need and demand for mental health services. So what exactly are kids dealing with? So in terms of the pandemic, let's talk about teenagers first. So a recent meta-analysis, which looked at a bunch of different studies that were done in several different countries, concluded the same thing, that rates of depression and anxiety for teens across the world has doubled over the pandemic. So prior to the pandemic, about 11% of kids had an anxiety disorder, and about 10 to 12% of youth had a depressive disorder. Now we're seeing rates of 20 to 25% of kids have anxiety or depression. So remember, it used to be 20% of kids had a mental health disorder. Now we have 20% of kids who just have depression, and then all the other mental health disorders on top of that. So these are the things that we're commonly seeing. Additionally, for whatever reason, the pandemic seems to be impacting teen girls in a more severe way than teenage boys. So it's impacting both, but we actually have seen double, triple the rates of girls coming to emergency departments for suicidal thoughts and suicidal attempts compared to males. So there's probably a lot of reasons why that is. Females tend to have higher rates of depression, anxiety pre-pandemic. And then given the fact that when the pandemic started, services were disrupted, that could have exacerbated that. Females tend to have lower self-esteem in adolescence, and then they're also often more likely to be victims of abuse, which we know has also increased during the pandemic. So those are some of the hypotheses. Our little ones have also had problems. So 22% of parents of kids 5 to 12, this is a national poll that was done, said that they have seen worsening emotional and behavioral health in their kids. Now, we're not seeing as high of rates of the depression and anxiety symptoms in the younger kids. Some of the things we are seeing, though, is an increase in aggressive behaviors. We're seeing regressive behaviors. So kids who are potty trained and toileting just fine all of a sudden starting to have accidents. Kids who could dress and feed themselves all of a sudden not doing those activities. And we're also seeing in our little ones an increase in obsessive compulsive disorder and tics. So across the lifespan, kids are struggling. We're just seeing it in different ways. In May of this year, Children's Hospital in Chicago did a national poll of parents. There was 1,500 parents who participated in this poll. Their children were ages 2 to 22. They asked parents if they had multiple children in their household to please respond to the child about the child who they had the most concerns about. So that's what these results are based on. 71% of parents who were in this poll basically said the pandemic has taken a toll on their kids' mental health. 69% of parents said the pandemic was the worst thing that has ever happened in their child's lifetime to their child. And 67% of parents said that they wish that they would have paid more attention from the beginning of the pandemic to their kids' mental health. So one of the things I've consistently seen from parents is a ton of guilt and a ton of I should have done more statements. And I think if you feel like that, A, that's normal to feel like that. You're not alone. A lot of people feel like that. And B, it's really easy to look back and say, I should have. And it's actually a really unhelpful strategy. And so as parents, most of us have done the very best we possibly can to support our kids. And as the pandemic goes on and we learn more, we're able to address this with different strategies. So I think looking back, if your kid has had an impact from the pandemic and their mental health, you're not alone, they're not alone, and there are things we can do about it. And it's more helpful to focus on what you can do now rather than beat yourself up on things that you haven't done. But if you're doing that, you're not alone, because that's a lot of people feeling that way. I would say that when we're thinking about our kids' mental health, it seems like mental health has taken a hit. And for a lot of people, they're saying kind of like it's taken a hit and it's kind of staying where it is. For some kids, their mental health is getting better, and some kids it's getting worse. But a lot of people are kind of like, we've kind of gotten in this zone. So if your kid's mental health was okay, it might be staying in that zone, or if it wasn't great, it might be staying in that same zone. So also, what are parents saying in terms of what's impacted kids the most? So by and far, social isolation is what parents are reporting have been the biggest and hardest things for their kids. And I think this is tied into remote learning, right? So you don't have that same connection. Parents have been really worried about screen time. I get routinely asked about screen time. Really, all that we know about screen time has kind of been thrown out the door. And I always tell parents, don't worry about the number of hours your kids are on screens. Worry about what screens take away from your kids. So make sure your kids are sleeping the right amount. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, that they're eating, they're doing their homework, and they're connecting with peers. If any of those things are gone, then look at screen time and if screen time is interfering with that. But if those cores are there every day, don't worry so much about screen time. So we just want to make sure the basis is there and screen time isn't taking from the other things. Now, with everything that has a negative, there are positives. And so some of the positive outcomes that parents are reporting is that 87% of parents said they're spending more quality time with their kids than before the pandemic. And that, you know, the majority of parents are saying that they're more affectionate towards their children. Part of the reason we also think that we're seeing more mental health problems spike up in kids is parents are around their kids more often, and they're noticing these things and catching them earlier than they might have otherwise. So all of those are positives. Okay, so why are we in this like mental health crisis? Mental health disorders come from two things. This is called the diathesis stress model. Diathesis is a fancy word. All it means is kind of like what you're born with and what you start the world with. So this is your genetics. This is the stuff that happened to you when you were in the prenatal environment. So you're kind of cooking in your mom's tummy, and then your early life experiences when you come out. And some of us have a really large diathesis, which means that we have high genetic loading and we've had early experiences that make it more likely for us to develop a mental health disorder. And there's nothing we can do about it. That's just kind of like what happened. And now some of us have a really small amount. When a mental health disorder manifests, it has to do with the amount of stress that gets poured on top of that. So depending on if you have a high diathesis, you only need a little bit of stress and mental health problems typically manifest. So if you have a really low amount of diathesis, you need a ton of stress for mental health problems to manifest. Now, if you think about the pandemic, I would argue even if you had no diathesis, there's been so much stress that you're going to be overflowing, and you're going to experience some type of mental health problem over the last 18 months. It might have been for a short period of time, it might have been for a long period of time, but it's something that all of us have experienced due to the chronic nature of the stress we've been in. The other problem is we haven't had a way to drain that stress out. So some of the best ways for kids to drain that stress is social connection, having a positive relationship with an adult who is not their parent. So all those things, the extracurriculars have been really put on the side. And so that's why the cups are overflowing. Okay, so how do we help our kids to take some of that out of their cup and teach them the strategies for them to be resilient and get through this next year? Now, one of the things that we want to work for is we want our kids to have integration. And so this is a model from Dan Siegel, who is a psychiatrist. He's written really great books about kids and teens. He has a book called Brainstorm that's awesome about teenagers. He hypothesizes that we can kind of fall into one of two camps. So we can either be really rigid, like things have to be this way all the time, or we can be overly flexible and then we're in chaos. So the goal is, how do you teach your kid to be flexible, adaptable, and stable all at once? So if you think about this, you can be stable, like you think about yoga, you can be very stable, but also really flexible. So have a solid core, but be able to, when something changes, go with the flow of that and make sure that you have what you need to survive in that situation. So this is what we're going for. And these are what these practices are about: flexible, adaptable, stable. Okay, so the very first thing that I encourage parents to do that's critical is ongoing connecting with your kids. So some of you have already have kids who have had mental health problems because of the pandemic or even before the pandemic. Others of you have not. These things can come up at any point. So some of your kids, as they transitioned into school, might have started having these problems. Other kids, it'll be like October or November, and finally, it'll just be too much for them. And so one of the things that will be helpful is if you have a check-in ritual where you ask, like, what problems are you struggling with that you can't solve? What's difficult or stressing you out right now? And then, like, what are you excited about or looking forward to? So just a couple of check-in questions, and you do it consistently. So for us, we do a check-in at night. My oldest is 3.5 years old, but we create this routine. And I encourage people to do this. It could be when you're driving with your kids at the dinner table, but that your kids consistently know you're going to ask about these things. If you have multiple kids, it's helpful to find a time to do this on an individual basis. And the reason the ritual is helpful is because kids might need to be asked something 15 times to have the courage to talk to you about it. But if you're always asking, they know they have a space to do that. And on that 15th time, that might be when they talk to you about it. The second is, if your kid comes to you and says, yeah, I'm really stressed out, or I'm having suicidal thoughts, or I'm really depressed, our number one response as parents, it's called the righting reflex. We want to immediately reassure our kids and fix the problem. Now, that comes from a great place, and it's incredibly unhelpful. So what needs to happen first is that we empathize and we validate our kids. So that sounds really hard. That's so scary. You're really frustrated. You're overwhelmed. What are you hearing your kids say? And saying that back to them and making sure that they know that you're listening. And once that your child feels heard and understood, that's when you can go into reassurance that this is what we're going to do to solve this problem. And also, especially with your older kids, asking them if they want your help in solving the problem, because sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. It's also important not to give our kids empty promises. So not saying, like, everything is going to be fine. You're not going to have to ever wear like a mask to school, or your school is going to be in person the whole entire year. Those are things we just don't know. And there's certainly things we hope, but it's important to make sure that we're being as honest as we can with our kids. And then finally, model. So talk to your kids about how you're feeling, what you're struggling with, and use a wide range of emotional words. I joke that most teenagers and adults have an emotional vocabulary of 3, which is I'm fine, I'm frustrated, or I'm tired as their kind of go-to responses. But there's research to show that if you can name how you are feeling, it actually, in MRI studies, it actually shows that your brain fires less intensely in the emotional regions when you're able to name the emotion. So name it to tame it. So teach your kids to name their emotions. Okay, the second thing is basic needs. They're so important. I would say the majority of mental health problems would be eradicated if kids got enough sleep. Most kids are sleep deprived in our country. So talking to your pediatrician, making sure you understand how much sleep your kid needs. having consistent bedtime routines. And so where screens are shut off, again, it's important to not look at screens because screens shut off the mechanism in our brain that makes melatonin. That's why it's not helpful to have light coming in. And melatonin is what helps us be sleepy. So have a routine with your kid every night. Make sure the screens are away. Make sure that your kid is only using their bed for sleeping. So not studying. If you do remote learning, not learning on your bed, because that confuses your body. And we only want our kids' beds to be associated with them sleeping. If that's the only thing they're doing in their bed, they'll have a better chance of falling asleep. So making sure your kid's getting adequate sleep, making sure their nutrition is there, and especially hydration. So a lot of kids are dehydrated. That makes stress management very difficult. So depending on your kid's age, for every year old they are, they need to drink an 8-ounce glass of water. So a 4-year-old needs 4 8-ounce glasses a day, all the way up until age 8, which is 8 ounces of water, or 8-ounce glasses a day, which is the recommendation for 8 and older. But make sure your kid has a water bottle and that you're encouraging that and having like family competitions. It's a small thing, but it makes a huge difference in your kid's mental health. The last thing I'll say is, in that flexible and adaptable, do your best to come up with multiple schedules for kids in case things change. And so if in the event remote learning did happen, try to keep bedtime and wake time the same, but have a schedule. And this is what our life looks like if we're in hybrid learning. This is what our life looks like if we're in remote learning. This is what our life looks like when we are doing school learning. It's a lot to have 3 routines, but it actually helps your kids know if things change, this is what they can expect and have some stability. So resiliency, the foundation of resiliency is 3 things. It's sleep and diet, and then your bank of positive emotions. So we also want to be deliberate in adding to our kids' emotional positive bank. So make sure that you do this by being present with your kids. Have no tech zones in your house, and make sure you follow those rules because your kids are going to take your example. Make sure that you're also modeling this. Like, today I felt joy when, today I was amused when, today I was inspired when. And get your family outside. We know that kids being in the outdoors for 30 minutes a day or more improves their mental health and improves their sleep. So as much as you can, try to get outside, especially as a family. I encourage families to develop a mystery grab bag. And this is just, you have a bag and you put a bunch of fun activities in it. So we're going to visit, a new park this weekend, or we're going to watch a movie, or we're going to do sleep in a tent in the backyard tonight. And, once a week you pull something out, or once a month you pull something out and you do something fun as a family. But those positive emotions, and this is just above and beyond like your regular stuff. How can you add 1 or 2 more things in there that is going to really help your kids? And then finally, with this, we know building positive emotions is about social connection. And I have a lot of parents ask me, like, how do I help my kids develop social connections when either they've been out of school for so long and they're hesitant to get back, or I have little kids who just were starting all of this and they haven't had the chance to practice. So a couple different things. If your kid is having some difficulty with social relationships at school, make sure that you create non-school related opportunities for them to connect. So that might be through neighbors, that might be through extended family members, maybe through a church or a community organization, but something that's outside of school, and that can help kids fight isolation. It's also important to know, on here I have what's called the performance anxiety curve. So we know that there's an optimal amount of stress that kids need to feel to perform well. So too little stress and they're unmotivated, too much and they shut down. So if your kid, if you know that social interactions are tough, maybe start with 1 or 2 like prized friends rather than having them go to a whole birthday party. So think about, how do you get your kid in that optimal anxiety zone? Maybe it's you go to the park, but you only do it for 15 minutes, depending on your kid. Or if you have an older teen, maybe you have somebody come over, but it's for a very specific activity and then they're exiting, so there's parameters on it. Also, discuss with your kids what makes a good friend. So talking to them about what does it mean to listen to somebody, and what is active listening? It's paying attention to somebody, looking them in the eye, repeating back the message that they're sending so they know you're listening. One of the other things that's also important is we know that kids who are good at regulating their emotions tend to have more friends. And so if you have a kiddo who has a hard time regulating their emotions, be their emotion coach. It's so easy as a parent to be like, get over it. So my 3.5-year-old, he spilled milk yesterday and he was just sobbing. And it was the worst thing that had happened in his 3 years. And I was like, buddy, it's not a big deal. I'll just get you another glass of milk. And of course, that did not make him feel better. And I was frustrated and I was just like, this is insane. But really one of the things that's helpful is if we can coach our kids through and be like, you're really sad right now. You're really frustrated right now. What can we do to take some slow breaths, or how can we focus on something else to reset? And coach your kid through that instead of telling them it's fine or you're reacting too much or get over it. Coach them through how to regulate their emotions, because that's a skill that they have to learn, and you explicitly coaching them will help. And then finally, practice. So practice with your kids. Practice with kids like how to open a conversation. Asking people like, you know, what kind of food do you like? What did you do this summer? What are you going to be for Halloween? And helping generate that. And also it's so important to teach our kids how to repair relationships and say they're sorry. Research on 8 to 9-year-olds showed that when somebody like knocked over a tower they were working on, they were able to like accept an apology, but their distress and their anger didn't go down until that person actually actively helped them build the tower again. So it's important for us to not only teach our kids to say sorry, but how do you make amends as an important aspect of social skills. All right, and then finally, I just wanted to briefly talk about how to cope with the stress. So, you know, masks are a thing that our kids are dealing with. My 3.5-year-old wears a mask every day to his daycare. And so when I saw this meme, it really spoke to me. So a couple of things I wanted to address. I would say over the last month, one of the questions I get most often from parents is, well, wearing a mask for my young child or for my kid in general, like, will that hurt their mental health? So my response is we have no research to show that masks hurt children's mental health. What we do know hurts their mental health is social isolation. And so masks make it more likely that kids will stay in school. And so I generally encourage parents to work with their kids on wearing masks so they can stay in school as a safety measure. Certainly there are children who have developmental disabilities, autism, sensory issues where masks are incredibly challenging. And so I'm not going to say that masks by and large are like, it's not a big deal. For some kids, it's harder, and there is no reason for us to think it will harm them long-term. No research on that. So a couple of things you could do to help your kids with mask wearing. If your kid is really struggling, making sure that you're practicing at home, having them wear masks, like doing very enjoyable activities that are like low energy. So watching one of their favorite shows and seeing, let's start with 5 minutes and then praising them and rewards, and like, let's build up to 30 minutes. Having your kids pick out their own masks so they have some ownership. Really focusing on why mask wearing is important, which is we're trying to keep other people safe as well as ourselves safe. Making sure for kids the mask is comfortable, especially if your child has a sensory issue. And then finally, we kind of have to like walk the walk if we're going to talk the talk. So even though you may be vaccinated and there might be a policy that you don't have to wear a mask in a certain space, wearing a mask in solidarity with your children is incredibly important to show that everybody is doing this. It's too confusing for kids if the rules are different for you than they are for them in this area. So how to help your kids. So some kids are going to have stress and distress around mask wearing. Some are going to have stress and distress around COVID, and are they going to get sick, or is my family going to get sick, or just what's going to happen. So one of the things I'd like people to remember is anxiety is a natural emotion that has a really important purpose, which is to either fight or run away. And it's essentially helping us survive. So if a tiger comes, you know, I'm going to have this response, this anxiety, fear response, I'm going to run away. That's a positive thing. It's going to increase the chance that I live another day. The problem for us and our kids is that a lot of times we have this strong anxiety response, like our life is threatened, when it's not, and we're going to want to run away. This is called experiential avoidance. So going to school makes me anxious, so I'm going to stop going to school. Or working on that particular homework assignment, I don't know how to do it, so I stop doing it. And the great thing about experiential avoidance is anxiety goes from here to here. It immediately works. That's why we do it. That's why we procrastinate. But the problem is you're always going to come back to the anxiety. And the next time the anxiety is actually stronger because, oh my gosh, this thing is back and I didn't get it done. And so our urge to run away gets stronger and our anxiety keeps getting stronger and stronger. So exposure is the best way to get kids through that, which is to naturally learn that anxiety goes up. And your body and your mind can learn that if I go through the anxiety nothing terrible will happen, and anxiety naturally goes down on its own. So rather than me escaping to get rid of it, how do I naturally ride the wave? So I encourage parents with your kids, giving them education about things. So if your kid's worried about COVID, talking about the difference between possibility and probability. So it is possible that they could get infected, but it's highly improbable that it would have a dramatic effect on their health. And so having those conversations can be really helpful with kids. Also, if they're having trouble going to school, like, why is school important? And this is the plan. So this is when you get to school, this is who we're going to hand you off to. When you're having a really hard time at school, we're going to create a self-soothing box that you can pull out. This is your strategy. And then encouraging them and doing that supportive approach to those things. So one really important thing. And then finally, just build your kids' parasympathetic system. So this is the fight or flight. Sympathetic is the fight or flight. The parasympathetic is what calms us down. It's physiology. It happens without us doing anything. Our body just takes over. The cool thing is, though, we can do things to kick in our parasympathetic systems and make them stronger. So for your kids, everybody's heard of mindfulness. Mindfulness is what strengthens your parasympathetic response. So here's a couple of apps. If you Google 4-7-8 breathing, that's an awesome strategy, especially if you have kids who deal with panic. Practice these things. The Sesame Street is good for our young kids, 6 and younger. The Breathe to Relax, your older elementary, middle school, and high schoolers. Calm and Headspace is great, but they do cost money. Those are good for kids and adults. So a couple of things, but here's the one caveat. Don't have your kids practice these when they're anxious. You want to have your kids practice these things when they are in a calm space, and you want to have them practice them for 2, maybe 3 weeks, but at least 2 weeks for 5 times each week. So 5 days, they're doing 2 to 3 minutes of this breathing before you would ever introduce this as a strategy when they're anxious. The reason for that is it's a brand new skill. So if you never knew how to learn or shoot a free throw, I might have you practice once. I'm not going to throw you in the game and have you shoot a free throw. I need you to get that skill down in a low stress environment before you use it in a high stress environment. So try that with your kids. So with that, here's a couple of different resources that you can utilize if needed. Again, I think it's really important. In my favorites list on my phone, I have all the crisis lines in Colorado. So if I ever came across an adolescent, a kid, a colleague, or myself in crisis, I would have that at my fingertips to provide that. Also, Child Mind Institute has awesome mental health resources for parents, so highly recommend that. So with that whirlwind, I will take questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was excellent. I really appreciated the hands-on tools that you gave as well. We do have some questions coming in. The first one says, I'm a DPS parent, but I also work in a research organization on helping schools with student well-being. And I'm curious about Dr. Glover's thoughts on the recent study in PLOS1, so +1 from Rosen et al. That found passive screen time was one of the biggest predictors of psychopathology during the pandemic, bigger than sleep, time outside, family rituals, etc. It really challenged much of what I've been telling schools about screen time. It also found stable routines were highly important. Did you have a reaction to that?
Yeah, Laura, thanks so much for your question and providing this really valuable piece of information to the families who are here today. So that is true that they found that passive screen time. So passive screen time, you've all done it, I've done it, is when you're just scrolling through and you're kind of mindlessly absorbing content. And so you're scrolling through like your Facebook feed, or you're looking at different stories on Instagram. And what they have found is that tends to be the worst kind of screen time. And if you think about this, media consumption is just like caloric consumption. Some calories have a much better benefit for our body, right? So there's certain foods and a diversity of foods that when we put in our body are going to have a much better bang for their effect. So I love the Doritos and Mountain Dew, but if I'm feeding that to my body all the time, it's going to have an effect on it. And so passive screen time is that kind of negative caloric intake. That's terrible for our bodies and our kids' bodies and psychopathology. What tends to be helpful is active screen time. So this is when you are actively engaged with the screen, with maybe you're talking to somebody else about like something that you're viewing. Maybe it's an app where you're able to create something. So you're creating a game like Fortnite, things like that, where there's this active aspect involved. Also, we know that social media is actually really great for kids to connect with other kids as long as they're using it to facilitate in real life connection. So using it to plan something where we're going to meet up is incredibly helpful, but just doing that, and that's the only mode, that's not so helpful. So to the point of this question, it's really important to know, first of all, what are your child's unique needs, but also what is the quality of the content that your kid is consuming. And so I said earlier, like if screen time is not impacting sleep, if they're still getting homework done, if they're still getting outside and they're still having those routines, don't worry about it. Probably to this point, you should check in and make sure, is there active screen time that's happening? Is there engagement versus just that passive component to it? So thanks so much for that point, and bringing that up to the audience.
Great. We have a question about what are some ways to identify your child's level of diathesis?
Yeah, that's a hard one. So part of it is knowing your family history. I think probably in 20 or 30 years, we'll have a lot more specific ways, like through blood tests that you can, and genetic testing that you can. Like right now, we actually have a lot of research that's just in development that we're able to start doing some genetic testing to know what antidepressants work best for people based on their genes. So in 20 or 30 years, it'll look different. Currently, part of it is just knowing, like, did my parents, their siblings have mental health problems, anxiety, depression, which is hard because people didn't talk about it quite the same way. Also, were there any events in their prenatal environment that were traumatic to them as a fetus? And then in their early life, did they have adverse childhood experiences? So this is things like housing insecurity, food insecurity, a cared one being incarcerated, neglect or abuse in the first couple of years of their life. All of those things would help you kind of get an idea of how much diathesis a kid might have. But honestly, it sometimes is very hard because we don't have a good family history.
Great. Do you have go-to resources or websites to visit that have good sentence stems, like you mentioned, on checking in or reframing things if something frustrating happens?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I can actually look and send this to the event organizer so they can send this back out, because off the top of my head, I don't, but I'm certain that I could find things that would be helpful to parents and scaffolding that. So I will find resources and send them along.
Great. And as a reminder to everyone, this recording, as well as any resources that Dr. Glover passes along, will be sent out to everybody that registered for the webinar. So, and as a reminder, again, if you have questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. Okay, here's another one. If you think a child needs more than what you can provide, do you recommend asking the school counselor or the pediatrician first?
Yes, so school counselors are a great resource. I think pediatricians, I recommend most parents talk to pediatricians as a starting point, because pediatricians will have screeners in their offices to immediately screen for a variety of mental health problems. Most insurance, unfortunately, is designed in a way where you might need like a referral from a pediatrician to get into mental health options, but also DPS has many great mental health supports as well. So I think talking to both can be very helpful, but your pediatrician is a great first place to get those screeners and to identify, is this a mental health problem versus is this just a short-term struggle that my kid is having?
Great. It says, hi, DPS parent here. Any thoughts on how to speak to a 3.5 and a 6-year-old about a grandparent who is currently hospitalized with a COVID breakthrough infection?
So Tiffany, first of all, I'm very sorry that one of your family members is going through this. I think one of the things is to be as direct as you can in the shortest amount of information you can give your kids. And so we want to make it age appropriate. And so being able to say something like grandma or grandpa is very sick right now, and they have to be in the hospital. Your kids probably know what COVID is. My 3.5-year-old knows what COVID is and has had like 6 COVID tests. And so being able to say, they have COVID and they're getting lots of medicine and we're taking care of them. And we're going to make sure that the doctors do whatever they can to make sure they feel better as soon as possible. I would leave it at that and then ask your kids if they have any questions.
Awesome. Well, that looks like that concludes our questions. But just really want to thank you so much, Dr. Glover for being here and being a resource to our DPS parents. And as a reminder, we'll have this up on our website, which is dpsprevention.org, as well as you should get an email with all of these resources.
Well, thank you, everybody. Be well, and take care of yourselves, not just your kids' mental health.
Awesome.